So Austria is, I consider her a professor of mine. She teaches me college level curriculum and the traditions and concepts. My name's Derek, and I'm an alcoholic. How are you guys?
Hey, Derek.
My story is I get right into the steps. And through the steps, I can kind of reflect back on my story, and I think you can identify with my alcoholism through that process. In July of 2016, I left my wife. I had collapsed in a drunken stupor with too many Ativan in my system, and the paramedics rushed me to the hospital. And my sister and my brother figured, along with my best friend, that we had to get Derek out of this relationship. It was killing him. I had been maintaining sobriety with painkillers and then Suboxone. But when that ran out, I ended up getting really drunk, and I had already passed that imaginary line that we talk about in the program, where I had gone from a heavy drinker to a real alcoholic. That had happened some years before, although I didn't know it. And at the time it had happened, alcohol was still my solution, or I thought it was my solution. So here I am. Paramedics are shining the light in my eyes. My wife is a crazy narcissist alcoholic, and she's screaming at me, even though the paramedics are trying to attend to me. And my sister and my best friend can hear this in the background because she had called them on her cell phone. Next thing you know, I'm on a plane to Washington to get me out of that situation, and I told my wife that I was leaving her. That didn't last, but through the summer, I didn't seek help. I sat on my butt. I had lost my job, not because of my alcoholism, not because of alcohol, but because of my alcoholism. I had become bitter and resentful in my corporate career. And looking back now, I realize it was the progression of my disease and how I was trying to attend to it through my own means of recovery. What ended up happening that summer is I didn't seek out the rooms of AA. I didn't think yet I was an alcoholic. I sat on my butt and watched movies and thought, well, after the summer, my serenity had returned, or what I thought at the time was serenity, and that my wife was the problem, and that I was okay and I was intact. That was not the case. I returned to California on 2 job leads for vice president of some real estate company. I was a corporate go-getter. I was an overachiever. I was well educated, an MBA, a law degree. None of that filled this empty hole in my heart that I later realized was a God-shaped hole. So I go down for these job leads, and instead what I found was my last drunk. And it proceeded from Christmas Day of 2016 through February 16th of 2017. And it was in that moment, those days before, I think it was Valentine's Day, I had gotten together with my wife. She was now drinking a half gallon a day. She was $140 in weight, and I had come to realize that she was drowning in this. This broke my heart. I was in a severe depression, and I fell into my last drunk. I couldn't get out of bed those last few days. I was staying at friends, and I was driving down to the supermarket in the morning about 6 a.m. to get my half gallon of vodka, because that's what normal people do on a daily basis. And so I would have these rational excuses in my head as I would go into the supermarket to buy this half gallon, and I looked like a wreck. The friends I was staying with said, Derek, you're drunk 24/7. You got to get out. I couldn't get below a 0.25 without starting to shake. And I remember there was this moment, and I call it my dark night of the soul. And it was the 4 horsemen: terror, bewilderment, frustration, despair, to a level I had never experienced before. And I wished for the end. I couldn't imagine life with or without alcohol. When I read in Vision for You, The Jumping Off Place, I go, oh my God, that was what I experienced. somewhere between that jumping off place and I was wishing for the end, I realized, holy shit, I'm wishing for the end. Something hit me deep in my core, and I reached out to a God I didn't understand with complete abandon. Everything I thought I was, everything I thought I knew, felt stripped from me. It was like I was totally annihilated. And I reached out to this God, and within 3 days, I was back up in Washington. Uh, and I was sitting in a hospital bed and detoxing from alcohol. And after that, my sister and brother-in-law said, "Well, to live here, you're going to have to go to an AA meeting a day. Uh, you're going to have to go to therapy. You're going to have to get a job. You're going to have to do all these things," thinking that I wouldn't accept their offer to stay with them. But at that time, I was so desperate. I said, "Yeah, sounds great." They were thinking I'd say, "Screw you, I'm out of here." But where was I going to go? I'd lost everything. So I got detoxed from alcohol. On the ride, my brother-in-law picked me up from the hospital. Non-alcoholic, or I would say he is, but we don't pronounce anybody alcoholic, but he's a big boozer. But he's never sought help, and his life doesn't appear to be unmanageable. But his parents were raging alcoholics, and he saw what AA did for them. And so he gave me the talk on the way back from the hospital that put me over the edge regarding AA. Here was a non-member uh, selling me on how awesome AA was and what it did for his parents. I didn't know it then, but I was learning about attraction versus promotion. Um, I went into my first AA meeting completely broken, having reached out for help, and I walked into this church, and I felt warm in this building. And I walked into my first meeting, and I had been to AA before, but I heard things in this meeting I swear I'd never heard before. I heard, get a sponsor, you work the steps, you go to meetings, you get involved in service, work through that big book, work through the literature. You're going to have a spiritual awakening, and you're going to stay sober. Never heard that before. Although when I returned to Southern California on business or on a visit, I'd go to the same meetings that I went 2 years before, and that's exactly what I heard. I just couldn't hear it back then, but I heard it now. And you know what? I said, sounds great. That's what I'm going to do. Started going to meetings every day. Found a sponsor. Now, I don't know how that works. I think God was involved. But after about a month, I found a sponsor. He was a codependent, well, I'm also codependent, by the way, so that was a Freudian slip. But he was a chemical dependency counselor and had 34 years of sobriety. I thought, great, I'm supposed to go to counseling. I'll have him as a sponsor, and that'll kill two birds with one stone, right? So he became my sponsor. Now, imagine that. I reflect back on this now, but at 34 years, I'm at 7 years, and the thought of sponsorship sometimes is tiresome. I've started sponsoring very early, about a year after I had my spiritual awakening. And my first sponsor showed up like when the student's ready, the teacher appears. For me, when the teacher was ready, the student appeared. And within 1 week of me recognizing I had a spiritual awakening in the steps, two sponsees asked me to sponsor them. Both are no longer with us. But at the time, I thought I was doing really well, and they were getting sober, and they were starting to have spiritual awakenings. So anyways, I get the sponsor, and we sit down, and he says to me, he goes, "So, are you an alcoholic now?" Remember, I don't know anything anymore. That's how stripped my mind was. So I didn't know what an alcoholic was. I thought I had known, but now that I was giving up everything I thought I knew, I said to him point blank, honestly, I don't know. He goes, "Well, maybe you should go try some controlled drinking." I go, "Hell no, I'm done with that. I don't ever want to go drink again. Please help me." He goes, "Okay, well, you're an alcoholic." He goes, "So now you're powerless. What are you going to do?" And I go, "I don't know, try and fix myself." He goes, "Well, how are you going to do that? You're powerless." And I thought a minute. I go, "Yeah, that's right. That makes a good point. So I'm powerless. What now?" He says, "Well, you're not going to fix yourself. God is. Do you have a higher power?" And it's like, I don't even know. what one is. He says, well, you got to go find one. I want you to write up, I want you to really wrestle with the four components of step two. Um, you know, came to believe in power greater than ourselves that could restore, and sanity versus insanity. And so he really wanted me to struggle with this. He thought for me this would be the key to my program, and it turned out it was. He also said, look, you're not going to be able to think your way through this disease. You have the mind of an alcoholic. And it says, so you're very smart, and that probably puts you at a disadvantage working these steps. And that was the first time anybody had said something like that to me. And I was like, oh man, I'm at a disadvantage for my brains. Holy shit. I was freaked out. So he said, really struggle with step two, try and think your way through it. And I go, well, how am I going to do that? I thought back to college when I learned, through writing term papers, what a tragic hero was. That seemed to be how I would struggle through a paper and really come to know the subject matter. So I started writing a term paper on step two, APA format, double spaced, 30 pages of absolute bullshit, and when I showed it to him, he goes, what do you think? He goes, I'm more confused than when I started. He goes, great. He said, that's right where you're supposed to be. I go, it is? This program was counter to my understanding and my ability to think through anything. He says, you need to get out of the way. Now you're trying to think through everything. Well, you asked me to think. He says, I wanted you to struggle to find out that you can't. Right. So I came back a week later with 5 pages, even more confused. And finally, at 1 page, he says, I give up. I can't think my way through these steps. He goes, great. You're right where I want you. Holy shit, what the hell kind of program is this? All right. He says, all right, now we're going to work on step 3. Go contemplate step 3. And I go, contemplate? He goes, yeah. In 1939, when Bill said prayer and meditation, the definition of meditation is contemplation of serious thought and contemplation of meaningful subjects, such as your higher power. You're going to need one, go find one. So I was imagining myself having third step experiences. Meanwhile, 2 months of sobriety, my wife is real sick, and she's not eating, and she's lost a lot of weight. I'm thinking she's dying from the disease. This is what somebody at 2 months does. I'm going to drive down to California and save her and get her into the hospital. But I realized at this time is that I didn't have sobriety as well as I thought I did. And I got scared. I didn't really consult my sponsor. Of course, he knew I was going to go regardless. So I drove down there through the night. I'm saying the Serenity Prayer over and over because I'm scared to death of my disease. And I drove straight through because the adrenaline was pumping and fear. And I was coming down the 101 where it meets the 405 before dawn. Still come to believe in sanity and restoration and God are all, jumbled around. And about 5 a.m., all these cars start racing by me, rush hour heading into LA. And I was driving like 65 miles an hour, and I was in a very meditative state and everything. And I go, holy shit, this is insane. Everything lit up. And in an instant, I saw infinity. I saw God. I understood step 2 somehow. Like I had come to believe, only I didn't know how. I had a resentment against my previous employer, and I saw that I actually hated the industry and the job that I had worked in, and that it was all in me. And that resentment and that huge, huge pit of anger that I felt towards them evaporated. And this is the first I had experienced the feeling that it felt like letting something go. It was almost metaphysical. And it was like I understood that there was something special in AA. I couldn't tell you how I knew any of this, but it was a white light experience. And from that point forth, it wasn't very hard to make a third step decision. And it wasn't very hard to do my 4th and 5th step. And it changed something in me. I got my wife into the hospital, and then I proceeded back home. And on the way back, I made a decision that I was not going to return to California ever again, that I was going to stay with my sponsor and my home group. That was another thing in the message that I heard that first meeting was get a home group. And I've had a home group ever since that first meeting. Um, and that has meant more to me than you can imagine. Um, when I made the decision, I had tried, I got baptized as a symbolic of tradition or step three. I had said the third step prayer on my knees. There was one point where I was so confused over step two that my brain was overstimulated and actually just stopped thinking for a moment. It was the first time I'd felt peace in all my life. And I kind of realized that it was my brain that was causing all the racket. And I felt something from above. I thought that was the third step decision. But in hindsight, it was really when I just decided to stay with AA and stay with my sponsor. And then subsequent to that, all of these doors opened up in my life. In 2 months, I used to take notes at recovery meetings. One of the guys from our district committee saw this and said, "Hey, you take notes. The district committee needs a secretary." And now he's just taking notes because, I wanted to figure out, how this program worked. Well, it turns out I showed up at the first district meeting at like 4 months sober, and all my favorite people from the meetings were there. And I had a business background, so I was like, this is good, this is business, right? I like this. So that secretary position, and then I was going back and forth from district to my home group business meetings and doing what a GSR was doing. Our GSR didn't give a shit about the district meetings, and so I was going. I didn't want to miss them, and plus I was taking notes and reading the secretary's report, and I thought it was super important. And I was doing an esteemable act. I was getting to know all the people in our fellowship, and I felt a part of, and something changed in that moment, and it was like I found home. Subsequent to that, our alt DCM left. I'm going to fast forward real quick, and nobody else had the enthusiasm for service that I did in that first year and a half, and so they nominated me to be the DCM. And I became DCM at a year and 10 months sober and struggled through that. But turns out I caught fire towards the end. And one of our area servants, elected servants, got a hold of me, lifted me up, said, "You're going to be an appointed, and I'm going to service sponsor you." And I did everything she said. And next thing you know, she walked me through qualifying at our last assembly. I shared my financial improprieties as I was advised by a couple of people who had been previous treasurers or alt treasurers. And now I'm serving as your area treasurer. Now that service has become a critical part of my recovery. But all of that happened after I made the decision to stay in the program. And I got a job at a law firm as a legal assistant. I had a law degree, but had never practiced law. I didn't know what I wanted to do. And they have this thing called character and fitness before you're admitted to the bar. And, I had a long record of wreckage, 4 treatment centers, 3 or 4 ambulance rides to the hospital, thinking I was having a heart attack, only they said, "No, you're just really drunk." And, things like that, financial improprieties, in debt with student loans. I owed money to the IRS because, I was a financial wizard. And I thought I could outthink, our United States Treasury, reclaiming 9 dependents instead of 0, and then ending up owing the IRS, because then when I make $1 million, you see, I'll pay it all back. Yeah. So I was borrowing from the IRS. All these things, right? So when you submit your application to the Washington State Bar Association, you have to disclose all of this, all your crimes, everything. The parking meter I tried to pull out of the ground when I was 18, like Cool Hand Luke, and stayed the weekend in Huntington Beach jail. and hung pictures on the wall of women like real hardcore prisoners, things like that. But no, so we'll get to that. But I did a 4th step with my sponsor first. And I couldn't wait to do it. And it was like, I can't fit it into the columns. I'm an educated person, but I couldn't simplify this to fit it into these freaking columns. And I swear to God, I went through, the instructions 1,000 times. I read ahead. Maybe I can glean some insight on the 4th step from what they say in 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. I'm doing all of this stuff because I overcomplicate the crap out of everything. So finally he said, just start praying and just start writing stuff down. So I got 11 by 17 ledger paper because 8.5 by 11 just wasn't big enough, right? I needed space. And pretty soon I started praying and it just started coming out, right? So I was writing this way and I was doing graphs and charts, and 45 pages later, I feel like my 4th step's complete. I walk into my sponsor with 45 pages of ledger papers stapled together with just writing all over. So he actually took the time to actually fit all of this stuff, except for the graphs, into the columns. And then we discussed what my part was, and I began to see the world differently. We did that for like 2 hours, 4 sessions of 2 hours each. Looking back now, with Andrew, there was something in my heart giving this thing away where the energy wasn't coming from me. And maybe that's what was happening with him, with me. But looking at myself, and I would have looked at me now, at myself back then, and I go, oh, I got a sick one here, right? But we got through it. 6 and 7, I did Drop the Rock. I know it's not AA approved, and the ripple effect, but that really helped me understand those steps. I did, at this time, I begged this guy in our district, who's kind of legendary in our district, because my sponsor didn't take me through the book formally, but I knew it was calling to me. So I begged him, and we sat down, and he likes to say, well, he was Whiskey Bill's sponsee, and he had this way of doing things, and a lot of the guys in our district had this book with all of this highlighting and scratches, and we sat down every morning at 9 a.m. and he took me through this big book, and it came alive. I saw myself in the book on just about every page, and I was hooked. And the way he presented it was just amazing. It became a part of me. When I went and did my amends to my wife a year and a half later in Hawaii, I carried this book with me, and I slept with it, and I held on to it because I hadn't flown anywhere. And flying for me was a big drunken experience. Show up early at the airport, like 3 or 4 hours early, and just have those cocktails and look at the international travelers and pretend I was one of them. I dreamed of bigger things. Like they say in step 12 in Bill's essay, childish, extremely sensitive or emotionally sensitive, and grandiose. That was me. When I read that, I just crapped my pants. I go, holy crap, that explains so much. But I embrace these things now. Finally, I have some answers. I don't give a crap that I'm a broken alcoholic, and who's been humbled. At least I know what the hell's going on now, right? I'm an alcoholic. I fit right into Alcoholics Anonymous. I'm just as screwed up as the next guy, and I can embrace those things now, and Easy does it. That was another thing. My sponsor told me, because I was a real intense, got to learn this thing. Spent the last week and a half writing a paper for PRASA. It's coming up, and this is just an example of how hyper-focused I get. I've been swimming in concepts and traditions, trying to get to the seed of this issue of whether AA World Services should sue AlcoholicsAnonymous.com and how the concepts and traditions apply. I've talked to past trustees and even members in our home district just to kind of get a layman's perspective on the matter, and went through all of the writer's blocks and all this stuff. This is how I torture myself. But I digress. So 6 and 7 were big for me because I finally started learning how to let go of these things. I finally began to identify where my thinking was messed up. And that mostly came through prayer and meditation, which my sponsor had me do very early on. And it was through these little increments of relief from the steps that I began to realize that I had always been in emotional pain. So that was masked with anger. And I was extremely fearful about everything. And that was generated out of the home life that I grew up in. And so by nature, I'm fearful, and fear has plagued me my whole life, and I did not know it. The only way it was a permanent condition in me. And when I first tasted alcohol, I felt relief from it, that 90% of our population doesn't feel when they take a drink. And I wanted more because I felt better. And it became my way of life and my solution, and masked everything while it was working. Then the wheels fall off and you go, and it doesn't work anymore. And now it's just destroying everything. And another thing is, with all the hell I've been through, I'm so grateful I'm finally here. That first step that I had was such a defining moment and set such a foundation for my recovery, as raw and as painful as it was, that after that, and feeling the relief from the steps, there's really, if I continue to maintain my program of sobriety, there's no desire to go back. I wouldn't, like Bill says, I wouldn't even drink if I could. I just don't want to. And like the 10th step promise, it's not like I have the obsession compulsion to drink anymore. I'm not the boy whistling in the dark anymore, wishing I could get away with drinks. The problem has been removed. I'm in a place of equanimity now. I can walk down the liquor. It doesn't even exist for me anymore. And that's crazy because I had nothing to do with that. And me wanting to figure it out, the obsession compulsion leaves us. I like Sandy Beach as well. Where did it go? I don't know. That was another precursor to how God was able to help me in 6 and 7. I didn't need to know how he fixed me, although I still contemplated constantly. How the F are you doing this? I ask him often, and I imagine he's cracking up. And 8 and 9. 8 was finding the willingness. That took me a while. There's still some that I haven't made because I lack the willingness, but they're on the list. And we grouped them like you often hear. Those I can make now, those I need some time, and then those that there's no way in hell. And believe it or not, the ones that are no way in hell, I'm making advances to make those amends now. How much time do I have?
About 1 minute and 15 seconds.
By the way, I did a 4th step with the Washington State Bar Association. And then I went up and I sat at the character and fitness hearing for 8.5 hours with 3 witnesses and an attorney, and did a 5th step. Told them everything. There were no trick questions. Why do you think you have problems with money? Honestly, I don't know. Probably when I was 12 and conned my stepdad into loaning me money for a bike, and then I told him I'd pay him back and never did. Things like that. They could, why did you continue drinking? Well, I believe it's because I'm an alcoholic, and I have obsession compulsion. You can't stop. So, and driving up there didn't matter whether or not I was this is the first time I felt the benefit of honesty. I was driving up to that hearing, and I knew I was going to be brutally honest. As honest as it took, without holding back, like it says in the 4th step, and or the 5th step instructions. And I did. But driving up there, God was with me, and I just got this feeling that it didn't matter, that I was going to be honest, and I was living this program, and God had me, and it didn't matter whether I got it or not. And I went in there with God, and I had this confidence I ordinarily would not have had. And I spilled my guts. And they made us sit in a room. They came in after about an hour. We took a vote. Welcome to the Washington State Bar. So I'll leave it with that. This program can cause miracles. So stick around until the miracle happens. Thank you.